The detention logs never captured what it was actually like to interrogate Han Solo, never documented the specific quality of defiance that made him different from the thousands of smugglers and petty criminals who passed through Imperial custody, never recorded the way he looked at you like he was already 3 moves ahead in a game you didn't know you were playing. My name is Agent Davrin Mexis, Imperial Security Bureau, and I spent 4 years tracking Solo through the criminal networks of the Outer Rim before finally apprehending him on Ord Mantell in what should have been a routine smuggling prosecution, but instead became the beginning of my understanding that some people resist categorization so completely that trying to process them through bureaucratic systems is like trying to capture smoke in a bottle. He was 26 standard years old when I arrested him, already notorious in underworld circles for the Kessel Run and for defaulting on a debt to Jabba the Hutt that should have gotten him killed months earlier, and my assignment was straightforward. Extract intelligence about smuggling routes and rebel sympathizers, document his criminal network, and either turn him into an Imperial informant or ensure he received appropriate sentencing that would remove him from operational circulation. The assignment took 6 months and ended with Solo escaping custody, me being reassigned to desk analysis as punishment for the failure, and a growing conviction that I had encountered something the Empire's classification systems weren't designed to process, someone whose fundamental nature was incompatible with the kind of control that Imperial authority required for its functioning. I first became aware of Han Solo through intelligence reports from Corellia, where he had apparently served briefly in the Imperial Navy before deserting after some incident involving a Wookiee slave and a commanding officer who wanted the creature killed for insubordination. The reports were vague about the details, classified at levels above my clearance, but the pattern was clear. Solo had shown promise as a pilot, had excelled in training exercises, had been on track for officer candidacy, and then had thrown away his entire career to save a non-human from legitimate punishment under Imperial military law. The action was incomprehensible from any rational perspective. Career suicide that gained him nothing except a wanted status and forced exile into criminal networks where his skills would be wasted on profit rather than properly channeled into Imperial service. The file included a psychological assessment that labeled him as having authority integration disorder and pathological independence complex, which were clinical terms for someone who couldn't accept hierarchy and who valued personal autonomy over collective objectives. The Empire generates millions of such individuals, of course misfits and deviants, who can't adapt to the discipline and order that Imperial society requires. And normally they get filtered into penal colonies or re-education facilities or simply disappear into the vast bureaucratic machinery that processes failures and transforms them into useful resources through labor extraction. But Solo had slipped through those processing mechanisms by fleeing to the Outer Rim, where Imperial authority was weaker and criminal organizations provided alternative power structures that rewarded exactly the kind of individualistic initiative that made him unsuitable for legitimate service. He became a smuggler, acquired a ship called the Millennium Falcon that was apparently famous in underworld circles for being fast despite looking like engineering disaster, partnered with the Wookiee he had saved, and built a reputation for taking jobs that other smugglers considered too dangerous or too stupid, which meant he specialized in the high-risk operations where normal risk assessment would counsel refusal. My investigation of his activities revealed a pattern of behavior that seemed almost suicidal in its recklessness, combined with inexplicable success that suggested either extraordinary luck or capabilities that weren't apparent in his official records. He had smuggled spice past Imperial blockades that should have been impenetrable, had outrun star destroyers in ships that shouldn't have been fast enough to escape, had talked his way out of situations where violence should have been inevitable, and had somehow maintained relationships with criminal organizations despite routinely failing to deliver on contracts or pay debts he had accumulated. The conventional analysis was that he was lucky and charming in ways that compensated for being unreliable, that his pilot skills were exceptional enough to make up for his lack of business discipline. But as I studied the accumulated intelligence, I started recognizing something else, a pattern of calculated risk-taking that suggested he was actually very good at assessment, even while appearing reckless, that his apparent improvisation was covering systematic evaluation of probability and opportunity that happened too fast for observers to recognize as planning. The Ord Mantell operation came together after we received intelligence from an ISB informant embedded in the Bounty Hunters Guild that Solo was meeting with a rebel sympathizer to discuss transporting refugees off a planet scheduled for Imperial pacification. The meeting itself wasn't particularly significant, just another small-time smuggling negotiation, but it provided opportunity to apprehend him without the complications that usually came from trying to arrest someone in hyperspace-capable ship with exceptional pilot at the controls. We positioned plainclothes agents around the cantina where the meeting was scheduled, coordinated with local Imperial garrison for backup support, and I went in personally to conduct the arrest because I wanted to observe him directly, wanted to see whether the person matched the patterns I had been studying in intelligence reports for months. He was sitting in a back booth when I approached, his Wookiee partner standing nearby, radiating threat that was barely contained under the thin pretense of civilized behavior. And when Solo looked up at me, his expression showed recognition before I even identified myself, like he had already assessed the situation and determined I was ISB before I spoke. I announced his arrest using standard protocols, informed him of charges related to smuggling and rebel collaboration, and he just smiled in a way that suggested he found the entire procedure amusing rather than threatening, like getting arrested was just another variable in whatever game he was playing, rather than serious jeopardy that could result in years of detention or execution if rebel collaboration charges were substantiated. ISB, huh? He said, leaning back in the booth with studied casualness. Must be a slow week if you're wasting resources on small-time cargo runners. Don't you have actual rebels to catch? The comment was designed to minimize his significance, to suggest that arresting him was beneath Imperial attention, but it also revealed something about his psychology. He understood how bureaucratic systems worked, understood that resources were allocated based on perceived threat level, and he was trying to position himself as not worth the effort even while he was already in custody. The strategy wouldn't work because the arrest was already committed, and because my assignment was specifically focused on him. But the fact that he tried it showed tactical thinking that was more sophisticated than typical smuggler psychology. I signaled for backup agents to secure him and the Wookiee, processed them through local Imperial detention, and transported them to an ISB facility on a nearby moon where interrogation could be conducted without interference from local criminal networks that might attempt rescue operations. The interrogation room was standard design, all Durasteel and harsh lighting and recording equipment that documented every word and expression for subsequent analysis, and I brought Solo in without restraints because I wanted to see how he would behave when physical constraint wasn't defining the power dynamic. He took a seat without being directed, adjusted his posture to look relaxed despite being in detention, and waited for me to begin with expression that suggested patience but that I recognized as active assessment, like he was using every second to gather information about his situation and evaluate potential responses. I opened with standard questions about his smuggling operations and known associates, establishing baseline while recording his responses and body language, and he answered with combination of partial truths and misdirection that was skillful enough that someone less experienced might not recognize how little actual intelligence he was providing. After 30 minutes of this, I changed approach, asked him directly why he had deserted from Imperial service, why he had thrown away legitimate career to save a Wookiee slave, and his expression shifted slightly, became harder somehow, and he said, "Because some orders are wrong, because following those orders would have made me complicit in something I couldn't live with, because there are things more important than career advancement, and if the Empire can't understand that, then the Empire is what's actually wrong here." The response was seditious by any standard, clear statement of belief that Imperial authority could be legitimately questioned and that personal morality could supersede institutional directives, and I should have flagged it immediately as evidence of ideological corruption that required aggressive counter-programming. But instead, I found myself curious about the reasoning, about what kind of psychological structure produced someone who genuinely believed individual conscience was more authoritative than properly constituted command hierarchy. I asked him to elaborate, asked what principles he thought justified disobedience to legitimate authority, and he looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been frustration and said, "You really don't get it, do you? You've bought into the whole system so completely that you can't even imagine that maybe, just maybe, an organization that blows up entire planets to make political points might not actually represent the moral high ground. I didn't leave the Navy because I'm anti-authority. I left because I'm anti-atrocity, and if you can't tell the difference, that says more about you than it does about me." The analysis was crude but not entirely inaccurate, and I felt something uncomfortable shift in my thinking, some defensive structure that wanted to reject his premise as obvious criminal rationalization, but couldn't quite dismiss the underlying question about whether Imperial methods were always justified by Imperial objectives. I terminated the interrogation after that exchange, filed preliminary report that documented Solo's ideological unreliability and recommended continued detention while full intelligence extraction proceeded, and I spent the evening reviewing recording and trying to identify what had disturbed me about the conversation. The content was obviously seditious, full of rebel-sympathizing rhetoric and rejection of Imperial legitimacy, but what unsettled me wasn't the content but the delivery, the absolute conviction with which he stated his position, like he had thought through the moral implications and reached conclusions he was prepared to defend regardless of consequences. Most criminals rationalized their actions through self-interest or situational pressure, claimed they had no choice or that their crimes were victimless or that they were just trying to survive in difficult circumstances. Solo didn't rationalize at all, just owned his choices completely and challenged me to explain why Imperial authority should be considered legitimate basis for overriding personal moral judgment. The question was dangerous because it had no good answer within Imperial ideological framework, because admitting that individual conscience could legitimately challenge institutional authority meant accepting that the entire hierarchical structure was potentially invalid if it commanded actions that violated fundamental ethical principles. The Empire's stability depended on the premise that authority derived from power, and that power established legitimacy through its capacity to enforce compliance, and introducing moral evaluation as separate criterion meant creating space for resistance that couldn't be eliminated through threat alone. Solo was articulating the philosophical foundation for rebellion without even making it explicitly political, just stating the position that personal responsibility for actions couldn't be transferred to superiors who gave orders, and that position was more threatening than any tactical intelligence about smuggling routes or rebel cells because it struck at the conceptual core of why anyone should obey Imperial directives. I conducted 6 more interrogation sessions over the following weeks, trying different approaches to extract useful intelligence while also trying to understand how he had developed his ideological framework. And each session revealed more about someone who was far more complex than typical smuggler psychology suggested. He had grown up on Corellia in the criminal underworld, had been exploited by various gangs and organizations, had learned survival skills that emphasized adaptability and calculated risk-taking, and had somehow emerged from that background with moral principles intact, rather than being corrupted into pure self-interest. The resilience was remarkable because his experiences should have taught him that individual morality was liability in world governed by power and exploitation, should have trained him to maximize personal advantage without concern for ethical implications, but instead he had apparently concluded that maintaining personal integrity was worth the costs it imposed, even when those costs were severe. His relationship with the Wookiee was illustrative of this pattern. Chewbacca had been enslaved by Imperial forces during military operations in the Kashyyyk system, had been assigned to labor detail under commanding officer who routinely abused non-human workers, and Solo had intervened when the officer had attempted to kill Chewbacca for what was classified as assault, but what Solo described as legitimate self-defense against abuse. The intervention had cost Solo his military career, had made him fugitive from Imperial justice, had forced him into criminal networks where his skills were undervalued and his safety was constantly threatened. And in exchange, he had gained a partner who was loyal, but who couldn't compensate for everything Solo had lost. The trade-off was objectively terrible from any cost-benefit analysis, yet Solo defended it without hesitation, said he would make the same choice again because allowing Chewbacca to be killed would have violated standards he wasn't willing to compromise, regardless of consequences. The absolutism was both admirable and frustrating. Admirable because it suggested genuine principled commitment rather than situational ethics that shifted based on convenience. Frustrating because it made him impossible to turn into informant through normal leverage techniques. Most criminals could be incentivized to cooperate through combination of threats and rewards, through demonstrating that collaboration served their self-interest better than resistance. But Solo's decision-making wasn't primarily driven by self-interest in ways that made standard incentive structures effective. Threatening him with extended detention or execution didn't produce the fear response that usually motivated cooperation, and offering him reduced sentencing or financial rewards didn't appeal to someone who had already demonstrated willingness to sacrifice material advantages for principles. He was operating according to value system that Imperial methods weren't designed to manipulate, and trying to break him through conventional interrogation felt increasingly like trying to use wrong tool for job that required capabilities I hadn't been trained to employ. I requested guidance from senior ISB analysts, described the interrogation challenges, and asked for recommendations about alternative approaches, and the response was bureaucratically typical. Continue standard procedures, escalate pressure gradually. Employ enhanced interrogation techniques if subject continues resisting cooperation, and document everything for review by supervisors who would determine whether Solo was valuable enough to justify continued resource investment. The guidance was technically correct, but practically useless because it assumed Solo would eventually crack under sufficient pressure, that his resistance was normal criminal defiance that would collapse once he understood the futility of non-cooperation. And my observations suggested that assumption was wrong, that his psychological structure was more resilient than standard profiles predicted, and that breaking him might require methods that would destroy the intelligence value we were trying to extract. I made the mistake of including this assessment in my reports, documented my observation that Solo represented psychological profile that resisted standard processing, and that assessment apparently triggered flags at higher levels because 3 weeks into the interrogation cycle, I received orders to transfer Solo to different facility for specialized processing that I wasn't cleared to know details about. The orders came with warning that my handling of the case was being reviewed for effectiveness and that my future assignments would depend on whether supervisors determined I had followed protocols appropriately or whether my documented hesitation about enhanced techniques suggested ideological unreliability that required correction. The implicit threat was clear: stop questioning methods and implement orders without allowing targets' rhetoric to compromise your loyalty to Imperial objectives. I should have complied immediately, should have transferred Solo without further engagement and moved on to next assignment without looking back, but instead I went to the detention cell one final time, told him he was being transferred, and asked question I knew was dangerous but couldn't stop myself from voicing. Do you actually believe the rebellion can win? Do you really think that scattered cells of idealists can defeat the most powerful military force the galaxy has ever seen? Or are you just committed to resistance for its own sake, regardless of whether it achieves anything? He looked at me for a long moment, measuring something in my expression, and then said, "Winning isn't the only reason to fight. Sometimes you fight because not fighting means accepting that everything you are is determined by what they tell you to be. Means surrendering the last space where you control your own meaning. The Empire wants everyone to believe resistance is futile, that power defines truth, and truth is whatever serves power's interests. I fight because I refuse to accept that premise, because I believe that meaning comes from what you choose to stand for, rather than from who has the biggest weapons. And even if the rebellion fails, even if we all die without changing anything, at least we died as ourselves rather than as whatever the Empire wanted to make us." The answer was simultaneously naive and profound. Naive because it dismissed practical realities about power and survival. Profound because it articulated something about human dignity and autonomy that Imperial ideology couldn't acknowledge without undermining its own foundations. The Empire functioned by convincing people that resistance was futile and that accepting Imperial authority was only rational response to overwhelming force. And Solo was saying that rationality wasn't the only valid framework for decision-making, that some choices were worth making even when they were tactically stupid because those choices defined who you were in ways that survival alone couldn't. I understood in that moment why the ISB was having me transfer him rather than continuing interrogation myself. Not because I was ineffective, but because extended exposure to his way of thinking was ideologically dangerous, because listening to someone articulate alternatives to Imperial logic created risk that interrogators would start questioning premises they were supposed to treat as self-evident truths. I filed the transfer paperwork, watched as security personnel loaded Solo into prisoner transport, and returned to my office to await review of my performance and determination of my next assignment. The review took 2 weeks and concluded that while I had followed technical protocols appropriately, my reports showed evidence of capture bonding and ideological contamination that suggested I required monitoring to ensure continued reliability. I was reassigned from field operations to desk analysis, given work processing intelligence reports from other agents, rather than conducting interrogations myself, and I understood this was soft punishment, way of removing me from situations where my compromised perspective might interfere with operational effectiveness, while keeping me employed in capacity where I could still be useful. Solo escaped from the specialized facility 6 weeks later, somehow managing to overpower guards and steal transport ship despite being held in high-security detention, and the escape triggered major investigation into security failures and potential insider collaboration. I was interviewed as part of that investigation, asked whether I had maintained any contact with Solo or provided any information that might have facilitated escape. And I answered honestly that I hadn't, but that I wasn't surprised by the outcome, because Solo was more capable than typical criminal profiles suggested, and because underestimating him was probably the actual security failure, rather than any active collaboration. The investigators didn't seem satisfied with this analysis, seemed to be looking for more concrete explanation that fit familiar patterns of corruption or incompetence, and eventually they concluded that escape had been a combination of security lapses and exceptional luck rather than systematic failure requiring major personnel changes. I continued tracking intelligence about Solo from my desk assignment, watching as he surfaced in various reports related to smuggling operations and increasingly connected to rebel activities, and the pattern that emerged suggested he was being drawn deeper into political resistance, despite his previous claims to be motivated only by personal principles rather than ideological commitments. He participated in the Yavin operation, apparently providing critical transport that allowed stolen Death Star plans to reach rebel leadership, and he received formal recognition from the rebellion despite having been paid for his services, suggesting that financial incentive alone wasn't adequate explanation for his involvement. He continued working with rebel forces afterward, served at Echo Base on Hoth, participated in multiple operations against Imperial targets, and gradually transformed from independent smuggler into committed rebel operative, even while maintaining rhetorical stance that he was just helping friends rather than embracing their political cause. The transformation was fascinating because it demonstrated what I had observed during interrogation. Solo's decision-making was ultimately driven by personal relationships and moral principles rather than by strategic calculation or ideological commitment to abstract causes. He hadn't joined the rebellion because he believed in their political program or because he thought they could win, but because he had formed connections with specific people whose struggles had become personally meaningful to him, and maintaining those connections required accepting their larger project even when that project seemed practically hopeless. The trajectory matched his earlier pattern of sacrificing career to save Chewbacca, choosing relationship and principle over rational self-interest, and the consistency was remarkable because it suggested his character was genuinely coherent rather than situationally adaptive the way most people's behavior was. The reports documented his involvement in increasingly critical rebel operations, including the rescue of Princess Leia from detention, the destruction of the Death Star, the evacuation of Echo Base, and eventually the operation to destroy the second Death Star and eliminate the Emperor himself. Each operation showed him taking risks that should have been fatal, surviving through combination of skill and luck that was statistically improbable, and gradually moving from peripheral involvement to central importance in rebel military structure. The Imperial assessment classified him as high-value target, someone whose elimination would significantly impact rebel operational capacity, and multiple attempts were made to capture or kill him through bounty hunters and special operations teams. All attempts failed, usually through circumstances that were difficult to explain through normal tactical analysis, and Solo's survival became almost legendary in both rebel and Imperial circles. I watched this progression from my desk, processing intelligence reports and filing analyses that tried to explain his continued effectiveness, and I kept returning to the interrogation sessions to the moments where he had articulated his worldview and challenged my assumptions about why anyone should accept imperial authority. The Empire had treated him as criminal and deviant, had classified his independence as pathology requiring correction, had invested resources in capturing and processing him through standard mechanisms for converting resistance into compliance. All of it had failed because the basic model was wrong. Because Solo wasn't resisting authority due to criminal self-interest or ideological corruption, but because he operated according to principles that imperial framework couldn't acknowledge as legitimate without undermining its own foundations. He represented alternative possibility, way of being in the world that didn't accept power as source of legitimacy, and his continued success suggested that alternatives might be more viable than imperial ideology admitted. The second Death Star's destruction and the Emperor's death created chaos in imperial command structure, and in that chaos, many of us who had been classified as potentially unreliable found ourselves reassigned or discharged or simply disappeared into bureaucratic limbo where our status became undefined. I left imperial service during this period, not through formal resignation but through gradual disengagement as institutional structures collapsed and authority became fragmented among competing warlords and remnant forces. I moved to the Outer Rim, found work as independent analyst for organizations that needed intelligence assessment without caring about my political history, and I tried to build new identity that wasn't defined by imperial service or by the surveillance state that had structured my previous existence. But I kept thinking about Han Solo, about the interrogation sessions and his articulation of why he had chosen resistance, about how his trajectory from imperial deserter to rebel hero validated the principles he had stated, even when those principles seemed naive or impractical. The galaxy's political structure had changed. The Empire had fallen, or at least fragmented into competing remnants, and people like Solo had been instrumental in that transformation, not through superior firepower, but through refusing to accept that imperial power established legitimate authority. The refusal had seemed suicidal when I first encountered it, seemed like pathological inability to accept reality. But in retrospect, it looked more like clarity about what reality actually consisted of, beneath the propaganda and threat that the Empire had used to maintain control. I don't know if Solo survived the subsequent conflicts, whether he found peace after the Empire's collapse, or whether he continued fighting in the various insurgencies and civil wars that characterized the period after Endor. The intelligence networks I had access to deteriorated as imperial structures disintegrated, and tracking individuals became difficult when entire planets were changing governments and identities were becoming fluid in ways that surveillance states depend on preventing. What I know is that encountering him changed how I understood resistance and autonomy, and the relationship between power and legitimacy taught me that the Empire's classification of him as deviant was accurate only within frameworks that were themselves questionable, that his daring wasn't recklessness, but calculated risk-taking in service of principles he valued more than safety. The confession I'm writing now is acknowledgement that the interrogation worked in reverse, that instead of breaking Solo's resistance, I was exposed to perspective that undermined my confidence in imperial ideology, that the capture bonding the ISB identified in my reports was actually process of recognizing truths I had been trained to dismiss. I don't know whether that recognition makes me better or worse analyst, whether seeing multiple perspectives is clarity or confusion, whether Solo's daring adventures were actually heroic or just lucky series of escapes from consequences that should have destroyed him. What I know is that after 4 years tracking him and 6 weeks interrogating him, and years afterward processing intelligence about his continued survival and success. I can't maintain the certainty that Imperial service required, can't believe absolutely that power establishes legitimacy, and that resistance is always pathology requiring correction. Maybe that uncertainty is the real victory he achieved, the actual damage his daring inflicted on Imperial systems, not military defeats or stolen plans or destroyed space stations, but the slower erosion of certainty in people like me who were supposed to process him through bureaucratic mechanisms, but who instead found ourselves questioned by someone who refused to accept our premises. The Empire could have survived military defeats if its ideological foundations had remained solid, if its personnel had maintained absolute confidence in their own legitimacy and the illegitimacy of resistance. But people like Solo undermined those foundations not through argument but through example, through living in ways that demonstrated alternatives were possible and that power didn't have to be accepted as ultimate arbiter of truth. I think about him sometimes, wonder whether he ever thinks about the ISB agent who interrogated him on that moon facility, whether our conversations had any impact on his trajectory, or whether I was just another Imperial obstacle he maneuvered around on his path from criminal to champion. Probably the latter. Probably I was forgettable within the larger pattern of his life. Just another bureaucrat asking questions and getting answers that sounded responsive without revealing anything useful. But he wasn't forgettable for me, couldn't be forgotten because he represented challenge to everything I had built my identity around, and that challenge is still present years later, still asking whether I made the right choices in my service to systems that claimed authority without adequately justifying why that authority should be accepted. The daring adventures of Han Solo from criminal to champion aren't just story about one person's journey through galactic conflict, aren't just narrative about smuggler who became rebel hero through series of escalating commitments. They're also story about what happens when someone refuses to accept the categories that power structures use to define deviance and legitimacy, when someone maintains principles even when maintaining them is costly, when someone chooses relationships and integrity over rational self-interest and survival. The Empire processed thousands of people like Solo, criminals and deviants who couldn't adapt to hierarchical control, and most of them were successfully broken or eliminated or marginalized into irrelevance. Solo survived and thrived, and helped bring down the system that tried to categorize him, and that survival suggests something about the limits of totalitarian power, about how control can be comprehensive without being total, about how resistance remains possible even within systems designed to eliminate it. I'm writing this from a cantina in the Outer Rim, years after the interrogation that changed my perspective, years after leaving Imperial service and trying to build new identity in Galaxy that's still determining what comes after Empire's collapse. I don't know if this confession has any value, whether documenting my encounter with Solo provides insight that anyone else would find useful, whether my experience of having my certainty eroded by exposure to his worldview is unique or common among those who tried to process him through Imperial systems. What I know is that he was right about the essential question, right that some things matter more than survival or career or acceptance by institutional authority, right that maintaining integrity has value even when that value can't be measured in conventional success metrics. The Empire taught me to see people as resources or threats, to categorize them according to their utility for imperial objectives, to process them through bureaucratic mechanisms that converted resistance into compliance or eliminated those who couldn't be converted. Solo couldn't be processed, couldn't be categorized, couldn't be reduced to the patterns that made others manageable. And encountering that irreducibility forced me to recognize that maybe the problem wasn't his deviance, but the systems that required conformity to patterns that eliminated the possibility of genuine autonomy. That recognition didn't make me rebel or resistance fighter, didn't convert me to political cause or ideological commitment, but it made me uncertain in ways that prevented continued service to institutions that required absolute confidence in their own legitimacy. Maybe that's the real legacy of his daring, the actual transformation his adventures produced. Not the military victories or political changes, but the slower corrosion of certainty in people like me who were supposed to maintain imperial control, but who found ourselves unable to dismiss questions about whether that control was justified. Han Solo went from criminal to champion through series of choices that consistently